when I was in 8th grade, my science class and I, we took a field trip to a lab in West Virginia to see what it's like when they prepare for a mission to Mars. And we did a little practice in the classroom, and one of the first sort of dangerous chemicals, it had warning labels on it, so I realized that was one of the first dangerous chemicals we had ever messed around with, was hydrochloric acid. And this was before the days of really good search engines. I think Google existed, but it was very different than you couldn't just type hydrochloric acid and be much more informed than even the best scientists like you could nowadays. And so all I read about was how dangerous this stuff is. It could burn you, and if you got it on your hand, you got to seek medical attention. And that's the extent that I knew about it. I had big fears of hydrochloric acid. And what was really interesting was that every time I would use it in our lab, I would spill some of the acid because I was so nervous about it. I remember we had prepared by keeping I think maybe it was baking soda on hand to neutralize any spills. And I would always spill a few drops outside the beaker, and then I would douse the whole area with baking soda. And so I would always ask a friend to help me with that, and everybody teased me for it. And then after a few weeks, I realized how stupid I was, that everybody was teasing me about pouring the acid. And I finally worked up the courage and picked up the bottle of acid, and now everybody's looking at me because of their experience just a few weeks earlier. And now I'm really nervous because I was already nervous about the acid, and now everybody's staring at me. And I poured all of the acid outside of the test tube, and our teacher was so upset. He didn't realize how nervous I was. He thought the whole thing was a joke. You gotta understand, he was in his probably 60s or maybe even early 70s. He probably doesn't understand our generation nearly as well, right? He probably thought this was a practical joke of some sort, but I was really nervous about it. And so I never again poured hydrochloric acid, not until very recently, now that I'm teaching chemistry. And I'm not scared anymore. In fact, I've messed with Aqua Regia, which is a mixture of hydrochloric and nitric acid, which can be used to dissolve gold. It's very good for cleaning glassware, and I'm not afraid of that either. I'm a little bit afraid of using it for experiments involving gold, like gold plating or stuff, but that's because I'm worried about the toxicity of gold compounds, not because of the acid burns. But I used to have big fears of hydrochloric acid. Another related fear is that I thought if actually, I recently did this experiment for you guys to see, but I used to think that if you put a battery into salt water, it would make a lot of chlorine gas. For one thing, the battery directly into the water, probably not, because the metal would get oxidized before chlorine comes out. But even electrolysis of salt water is not nearly going to fill the whole room with chlorine gas. I used to have a big fear of that. I would get ready to install batteries, and I would make sure my hands were dry. Right? I didn't have salty sweat all over it, or fluorine especially. I used to think that if you had fluoridated tap water and you got electrolysis in it somehow, it would make fluorine gas. And so I don't know why that terrified me to death. I knew fluorine and chlorine were used in World War II, and that's probably what feared me to death. I also thought the reason that electrocution could kill you was because, obviously, our bodies are full of salt water, and I thought electrocution was basically a chlorine burn throughout your body, right? That's I kind of related the two. It might produce a little chlorine, but I don't think that's the main reason it would kill or hurt you. But I had big fears of that. Before I moved here, I was looking at another apartment, and it was a basement unit, and we weren't sure if they had tested the place for radon. That's why I didn't move there. But I used to have another big fear involving radon. I knew basements had some basements had a lot of radon, and I knew that radon decayed. Radon is a gas, and I knew it decayed into other elements that are solids, right? Polonium, lead, bismuth, basically all the elements right before radon. So I thought the reason that you might have dust in your basement was because the material had started out as radon gas. It's floating in the air, and all of a sudden it decides to decay to some solid element, and that's where dust comes from. So I used to think that dust in your basement was especially dangerous. And I recently looked up a YouTube video on that, and sure enough, somebody actually did an experiment to collect dust from the air, and it was still radioactive. So I wasn't too off the mark on that, but it's a lot lower than what would hurt you. What else? I used to love the seaweed snack, and it would have this packet of water absorbent material in it. And I used to think that stuff, it obviously was some kind of chemical that reacted with water. And so I assumed that it was one of the reactive metals, like sodium metal, potassium metal. And I thought if you drop that into a glass of water, it would explode. And I really wanted to test my theory. I didn't want to open it. So we lived in Pittsburgh. I went to the Allegheny River, and I tossed the packet over a bridge, and I ran. And I didn't hear any explosions. The truth is, it was probably some kind of salt, right? Maybe calcium chloride salt. It was probably not sodium metal. See, I lived out of my car for some time, and one of the biggest challenges of living out of your car is that the windows fog up. And I thought about, I've tried using buckets of calcium chloride. I think I showed it in one of the videos. It doesn't really do as good a job as you would think. I actually thought about putting sodium metal in the car, but then I realized that it's so cramped in there. It's so easy to accidentally spill something in there, and I've accidentally spilled the calcium chloride that I keep in my car a few times, too many already, and even calcium chloride I don't like to keep in my car anymore. It's a sticky mess if it spills, so I gave up on that idea, but I used to have a big fear of it. I had some misconceptions about what red food coloring was. As a kid, I thought it was blood from some kind of animal. And so when I learned that the AIDS disease came from somebody coming into contact with chimpanzee blood, I used to fear that if you had red food coloring and you didn't cook whatever you were cooking long enough and the viruses were still active, you could get sick, right? Maybe not AIDS, but some other disease that nobody had ever heard of, right? Depending on what animal they got the red food coloring from. Right? Maybe it was bats or pangolins, right? So I used to have a big fear of red food coloring. Which is probably a good idea because there are other things in the red food coloring that are bad for you. And then I started to learn chemistry, and I was reading a book about all the different elements that had been discovered to this day, and I saw a picture of bromine, and I'm like, hey, that's red food coloring. Especially if you have a glass container and you put red food coloring in it, and it kind of stains the top of the container, it kind of does look like bromine. And it didn't make sense because all my chemistry books talked about how dangerous this stuff was, right? It was, it could burn you and stuff like that. Didn't make any sense to me at all. And around the same time, we started to phase out mercury thermometers, right? When I was a kid, we used to have thermometers that were filled with mercury, and now we have thermometers that were filled with this red liquid, and I thought that was bromine because that was the only other liquid element, and it didn't cross my mind you could put other things besides elements into thermometers, so I just assumed it was bromine. And I knew the other elements, and chlorine and fluorine were used in warfare. I wasn't sure about bromine, but I was really nervous about breaking one of those thermometers, right? But then I realized that we use iodine like on our skin for cuts, so I wasn't sure where bromine fell into in terms of how dangerous it was. And anyways, it confused the fuck out of me. And but that's how curious I was, and sometimes a little curiosity can go a long way, right? I wouldn't be surprised if somebody accidentally found the cure for COVID-19 and we go on with our lives just out of curiosity, right? Thanks for watching.